What I want to do in this lesson is talk more about what we were touching on in the last lesson as we talk about the principles of and theories relating to the sociology of education. And we're going to talk about the organisation of schools, and specifically talking about the organisation of classrooms, of the classroom structure, of classrooms. And we're going to highlight a number of different methods for organising children within classrooms, the sociological implications of each of these methods, and then talk about the pros and cons of each of these methods as well, drawing on some of our principles that we explored in the last video. So, specifically, we're going to look at incorporating the principles that we found in the last lesson, talking about things such as the concept of the hidden curriculum, as well as labelling theory. But we're also going to continue looking at sociological theory and talk about the more substantive classroom organisation within the school environment. So, this is a very contentious aspect within sociological theory because there are different methods by which we can organise a classroom. And what we mean by this refers to the different ways in which schools decide to sort pupils into different classes. And the reason why this is so important is because the sorting of pupils into different classes can actually have a measurable impact on the performance of some children. And the purpose, obviously, of schools is to have as many children achieve the best they can. So have as many children doing the best they can. So doing the best they can. And as such, we need to think about ways in which we organise children in these different school systems and in different classes to try and achieve this measurable impact, this positive impact. And there are three broad ways in which sorting can be done. We have a method known as streaming, we have a setting method, and we also have the mixed ability method. Now, we're going to talk about each of these individually in a second, but it's important to note that these are very broad methods by which we can sort children into class. Now, of course, we could probably get into complicated other methods, but these are all. Any other method that you would learn would just be a kind of a substrate of one of these methods already. And for the most part, all schools and all classrooms are organised in these kinds of ways, in one of these ways. So, let's talk about what each of these mean and examine them in turn. The first method is the method of streaming, the streaming method. And according to streaming, students will be sorted into different classes according to their ability. Okay, so we're doing according to an ability method of organising students. And this means that if the child is very intelligent, or we should really change that to higher achieving. So higher achieving, you can be very intelligent and still low achieving. Okay, if a child is higher achieving, then they'll be placed in the higher classes. Often in schools in the UK, we refer to these as sets. So the first set 1 being the highest achieving children, all the way down to however many sets that you've got, depending on the year that you're in. So this is a very simple way and a very intuitive way of placing children in and organising children in classrooms. But what this does is, according to the streaming method, is we don't just place children according to their class achievement, but we also apply this achievement to all other subjects. So what do we mean by this? So we're basing it on ability. So a child that's higher achieving will be placed in a higher achieving class. But this high achieving label, if you will, that we will give to this child will apply to all other subjects, or most of their other subjects. So for example, if child A was actually, we'll do it differently. If child X was an A-star mathematics student, okay, A-star mathematics student, then in this example they'd be placed in the top set for mathematics, but we'd also put them in the top sets for all the other subjects. So we'll have basically all of the high achieving, so HA for high achieving, all in one group, in one class that applies to all of their different subjects, and then we have the lower achieving children in their own. So we have almost separation between the two. Okay, that's what streaming refers to. The setting method tells us that we can organise children based on ability, so exactly the same as the previous method, but they don't have to stay in all of these classes across all the subjects. Okay, so instead of it operating like this, where somebody who does really well in mathematics will be placed in this high achieving classroom, and this class will be consistent across all of their other subjects. Instead of doing that, you could have a class case by case basis or a class by class basis. So it could mean that if child X is an A star in mathematics, just like we've just said, so an A star math student, but is a D student in English, okay. Well, this means that this student here will be placed in the high achieving class for mathematics and a lower achieving class for English. So we won't have this same kind of delineation between the classes. We'd have maybe this person will be in this class for English over here, but will be in this class for maths, or vice versa. And we'll have some kids from the low achieving group being in classes in the high achieving group because they're naturally better at some subjects than others, and vice versa. That's what the setting method means. So ultimately, if a kid is really good at mathematics, they'll be put in the top class for that. If they're really bad at science, they'll be put in the bottom class for science. Finally, we have the concept of a mixed ability system. Well, according to mixed ability, as the name suggests, students are sorted into classes, but it's not according to their ability. So they could just be ultimately randomly assigned into different classes. Okay. As a little side note, this is how I remember GCSE history going in my school. I remember being in a class. I was particularly at the time quite a low achiever in the school at the time, and I was placed in a class with, and it was a mixed ability system where we had children of all different abilities sitting together. So I was sat next to somebody who was particularly high achieving, and etc. etc. So this is what a mixed ability system would refer to. So you could have a mixture of higher and lower achieving children in all classes. Okay. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of all of these systems? Because ultimately they all have disadvantages and they all have some advantages. Okay. So the main advantages of the first two systems, because the first two systems are very similar in the sense that we are assigning classrooms based on ability. Okay. Well, the main advantages of this is that students can work at their own pace and at their own level, and they can do this together. So if we have a system where all the kids that are really, really, really good at maths are all in a classroom together, it means that the teacher can push those children at a level that is at their own pace, and so that they can be pushed further and further and further. Whereas if we had a mixed ability system where we had some children who were really good at maths and some children who were really bad at maths, then the teacher would either have to spend a lot more time working with the children with the lower ability, which would then ultimately take time away from the children of the high ability, which is not necessarily an equitable system. Or it would just mean that the children who are of lower ability will be looking at a maths board and not understanding a single thing that is written on the board. So we can have a situation where we have our own pace setting and we can work at the same level together. Okay. And it means ultimately that the high achieving students are not held back by the lower achieving students in the class. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing to suggest that we shouldn't want to have a situation where we have high achieving students not being held back, because ultimately what we said at the start is we're trying to get students to achieve the best grades that they can get. And if it means that some children who are really, really good might be held back if they're put in a classroom that is ultimately full of children who are lower achieving, then that might not be the best way of getting that child to get the best grade possible. However, there are obviously disadvantages to this system. Okay, it fails to recognise, specifically streaming, the method where we sort people by ability and they stay in the same class. Okay, this method fails to recognise the disparity in ability between subjects. Okay, there are very few students within a particular year group who are excellent at every single subject. Okay, I can probably think, in my experience, of a handful, maybe 5 or 10 students who are naturally just very, very, very good, and they're very, very, very hard working, and they achieve the top grades in every single subject. For the most part, students tend to be there tend not to be a huge disparity. We tend not to have a system where somebody's really, really, really good at maths and science and then really, really awful at other subjects. They tend to be similar, but there still seems to be a disparity between the ability in subjects. If you are somebody who is more mathematically inclined, you just intuitively understand mathematics more, then you might not achieve as high a grade in subjects such as English or history. Equally, and conversely, if you're somebody who really is good at writing essays and is really, really good at English and history and etc., then you might not pick up mathematics in the same kind of way. And so therefore you might not be able to do mathematics in the same kind of way. And so therefore we have a situation where some students are really good at some subjects and not so good at others, or really, really bad at others. And having the method of streaming would mean that the student can be in the right class that they need to be in for, say, mathematics, but they might be in the wrong class for English, and they might struggle with that subject and find themselves lost, or vice versa. Okay. So we can also evaluate these methods based on what we learned in the last lesson. We can also look at labeling theory as a way of trying to come to some kind of conclusion. And we can look at some sociological theory. According to Browne from 1981, it was found that teachers had higher expectations of children in the higher top-level class, and so therefore labelled them as high achievers and treated them differently. And the same, or at least the opposite, was true for the low achieving students. If you're a teacher and you knew that you were teaching the bottom set class, you might automatically go into that classroom with the expectation that these children aren't particularly high achieving, they're not going to be particularly good at the subject, and you might treat them accordingly. And that could lead to a negative labelling of that child or those children in that classroom, and therefore poor performance among lower achieving children. Now, one problem that we find with having an ability-based system up here is that if a child knows that they're in the bottom set for a class, then that might lower self-esteem and might cause them to act in a way that doesn't actually lead to them getting the best results. Because if you know you're in the bottom set for a class, then that automatically assumes that the school thinks you're not particularly good at that subject, and so therefore you might act accordingly. You might even just give up and say, well, if the school doesn't believe that I can do very well in this subject, then there's no point in me even believing it. This is one reason why these methods might not be perfect. But the concept of labeling theory is also a problem that exists within the mixed ability system, because rather than a teacher going into a classroom that's of the lowest set and having that expectation across the whole classroom, they might just have that expectation among particular students within their mixed ability class. So we can avoid the children having less self-esteem, because if a child who is naturally not particularly that high achieving in a particular subject is sat next to somebody who is, that might give them better self-esteem, and they might be able to that other person might be able to help this lower achieving student. But the teachers would still label those lower achieving students in that classroom and treat them accordingly. So the concept of labeling theory is still very, very important when it comes to both the ability-based systems of streaming and setting, but also the mixed ability system as well.